is bad right now, but if only the proletariat rises up and corrects the laws, we'll have a good world. And that's not quite tragedy either. This happens occasionally. There's a great tragedy by Aeschylus called Prometheus Bound, which ends with Prometheus saying, "I'm going to kill you all," basically. So there are hopeful tragedies possible, but they're few and far between. And that's certainly not the way a tragedy is supposed to work. So for Kafka, even questioning sort of the quality of the law will be to miss the whole point. The whole point is that it is precisely the fact of tragedy that makes things beautiful. It is precisely the lightness of Kafka's works, both in the good sense, the way that they feel sort of dreamy, the way that they put us into a calm, meditative state, even if they're distressing, the way that they give us space to contemplate what we're reading, the way that they're beautiful, and at the same time in their bad ways, the way that they make the characters oscillate between deeply conflicted to outright sociopathic, the way that they deny us any moment to properly grieve for something bad that has happened in the story, the way that they convince us that we are in a world inhabited by sociopaths, say, and give it up. The policeman is not just a jerk. You get the sense that the policeman is an evil person, except evil is the wrong word. He doesn't care about the morality of his actions. He's a sociopath. He has no sense of morals. Both in the positive sense and in the negative sense, that same lightness that robs us of sort of grounding that we can find in Kafka is precisely what makes Kafka beautiful. In the same way that the fact that something tragic happens is what makes Oedipus beautiful. So what does that have to say about the law? Kafka ultimately is an indictment of how people relate to the law. He does not think very positively at all of the relationship that humans have with law. But at the same time, he doesn't think that it is devoid of all meaning. He thinks that the law is oppressive, that the law looms over us like a monster whom we cannot possibly defeat, and indeed fighting the law will be meaningless. Kafka read aloud sections of the trial as well. Just like the penal colony, he burst out laughing hysterically at certain points. And in his diary, he writes that Joseph K., the main character, is guilty. That there should be no question about this. That Joseph K. is a bad person and is killed for the right reasons. Kafka does not give us any time to consider that the law somehow could be better. The law is the law, and it exists as an oppressive machine. And the penal colony actually has the best description of this, where the law actually is a machine that writes physically the law into your body with needles that are glass, so the spectators can look through the needles and see as words are being written on you over the course of 12 hours. But at the same time, Kafka thinks that having the law is better than having no law. Because with the law, there's a possibility of tragedy. The law makes struggles futile, but there is at least struggle. And this should sound very much like sort of the short version of existentialism. It is precisely the futile struggle that gives us meaning. Now, okay, granted, that's sort of back of cereal box existentialism. That is the shortest possible rendition of what existentialist philosophy is, and it misses most of the nuance. But there's still something to it. There's the idea that yes, humanity is objectively meaningless. We can't actually have the things that religion offers us, or the things that our own desires for material wealth offer us. But it doesn't really matter. If you buy the existentialist line, which I do, then there is something valuable in the process of being human, even though that process is a futile struggle. This point is probably a good time to point out that the actual title of the trial in German is The Process, with the word the in German. So actually, der Process. But it sounds really cool if I just call it The Process. That word has sort of a double meaning in German. It both refers to a legal trial and to any sort of process. So there's a sense of the trial, our interaction with the law, really being a metaphor for how we relate to life. So how do you read Kafka positively? You read him as tragedy. Kafka read Kafka as farce. Kafka laughed when he read his own stories. He laughed, we're not really sure what. His diaries are massively self-conflicting. But it's arguable from a lot of things he wrote in his diaries that he laughed at the meaninglessness, that he laughed at the absurdity of it all, which is often funny, actually. There are some Kafka stories that are very darkly humorous. Give It Up kind of makes me want to laugh every once in a while. in the penal colony makes me want to laugh hysterically, but I don't do that in good company because otherwise they'd come to take me away, haha. Kafka views Kafka as funny in a bad way. Kafka views Kafka as sort of a meaningless farce. But we don't have to. Kafka is also tragic in the best sense of the word. And that, I mentioned at the beginning that I'd argue that we ought not to read Kafka as Kafka reads Kafka. What's wrong with reading Kafka as tragedy, right? Shouldn't these two readings be on equal footing? As farce. Shouldn't it be possible to read Kafka as sort of redemptive tragedy and at the same time as cruel farce? Aren't these legitimate? They're legitimate. But one of them is more valuable to us as a reader. Because the way Kafka reads Kafka, the particular kind of farce that Kafka thinks Kafka is, doesn't give us anything to work with. We don't gain anything by reading more. The way Kafka reads Kafka, and this is written in his diaries at a few points, is like the end of the poem, the name of which I'm forgetting. Sorry, Ode on a Grecian Urn. That is all you know on Earth and all you need to know. In the poem, it's possibly meant ironically, but possibly I mean probably. I really like that poem. Kafka, in his diaries, says this about his own works. Nobody should read them. If you read one, you shouldn't read a second. If you read two, you shouldn't read a third. The only ones he'll consider letting anyone read are the most perfectly horrifying of them all. And even those, he doesn't want anybody to read. There's no point. There is good farce out there. Farce is not something that is not literature. But the kind of farce Kafka is describing is farce that we as readers cannot accept. It's the literary equivalent of saying to somebody, you are a bad person. There are ways to impugn someone's morality in text or in life that actually may not make you an awful person and may have a positive effect. There are plenty of stories that derive all of their power from the main character not being perfect. In fact, I argue that most stories derive at least their possibility to have power from the main character not being perfect. Has everybody read Paradise Lost? Okay. There are sort of two main characters in Paradise Lost. The devil and Jesus Christ. One of these two is an interesting character, and it's not Jesus Christ. The devil's fantastic. In Paradise Lost, the devil has all the fun lines. And Jesus is an unrelatable character because he's too perfect. Nothing happens. There are ways to write depressing things so that they can be read. Tragedy is merely one of them. But the sort of meaningless farce that Kafka sees in his own work is one that we as readers should not accept. Why does Kafka see this? I'm not sure. Kafka's own description of how he writes is as physically painful. One of my favorite stories by him, called The Judgment, one of the 6 that he actually was allowing people to read instead of burn. And also one that unfortunately is, I think, 12 pages long, so I can't possibly read it out loud, was written over the course of 8 hours in one sitting. No editing after the fact. From 10 p.m. to 6 a.m., Kafka sat at his desk, hunched over so his back hurt, and wrote constantly, never stopping. He goes on to describe what this felt like. It's not pleasant. Kafka's experience writing was physically painful. I'm not sure how much to read into that. It's deeply telling about the person, and it informs his literature to some extent. But also, these may not be things we need to share when reading Kafka. Certainly the author felt pain when writing his work. Does that mean we need to always experience his work as painful? That's the part where I break with Kafka. Kafka, for whatever reason, really was convinced that his work was bad. That not just was it bad quality, but that what it portrayed was not worth reading, shouldn't be read. Because by reading, you're supposed to gain something. And this stuff, if it's just cruel farce, you can't gain anything from. And I think that was incorrect of Kafka. I think Kafka missed the possibility for tragedy. That's roughly my theory of